Hi, I'm Mark Feldman, Senior Staff Engineer at Qualcomm Technologies. Today I'm going to talk to you about the Adreno SDK for Vulkan. There's a good deal of information about Vulkan on the Kronos website that will help you become familiar with the details and philosophy of the SDK. From the Kronos website, click the Vulkan tab. You'll find links to various presentations, an online reference guide, videos, and webinars. In particular, the Vulkan API reference pages provide exact API syntax for the complete API. The quick reference guide is a 13-page organized summary of the API. The registry has links to various extensions and layers written for Vulkan, and also to the Vulkan Conformance Suite, which you may find interesting. You'll also find Vulkan videos in the Qualcomm Developer Network, including others in this series, including our use of the Snapdragon Profiler and Vulkan applications. Also search for Kronos and Vulkan videos on the web. There will be taped sessions from presentations at recent conferences. You might also discover other web resources such as Vulkan sample code and frameworks that will be helpful in learning Vulkan programming. Keep in mind that our focus with the Adreno SDK for Vulkan is developing for the mobile platform. Our Adreno SDK for Vulkan is written to make use of Android Studio, a popular Android IDE written by Google. Android SDK is the official Android IDE and provides a useful environment for building, debugging, and deploying Android applications. We have developed and tested our SDK with Android Studio, so it provides a baseline reference for doing Vulkan development. Obviously, if you want to rebuild the samples using another IDE like Eclipse or IntelliJ, you should be able to. As you probably know, Vulkan is a C language interface and our SDK is written in C++. Thus, most any Android IDE will support these languages. Also, no doubt in the future there will be additional language bindings for Vulkan, so you'll likely have more flexibility. One more item. Since you are developing a Vulkan app for a mobile device, don't be concerned if your development machine doesn't have Vulkan support or a graphics card that supports Vulkan. Your goal with this SDK will simply be to create an Android APK that is written to use Vulkan and that can be deployed on a device that uses or has Vulkan drivers. You can download Android Studio from the developer.android.com site, and there are versions for Windows, Mac, and Linux. There are two options for installing the Android SDK. Make sure you download all Android Studio packages and not just the standalone SDK tools. After installing, launch the Android SDK Manager and make sure you're current with the SDK. Also, just for reference, when we released this version of the SDK, we tested with the current Android Studio 2.0, which was released in April 2016. Now go to the Qualcomm Developer Network page and download the current version of the Vulkan SDK. You'll be downloading a zip file that contains a set of files, but no explicit installer. It's a small download, around 10 megs, and it will only take a few moments depending on your connection speed. Just unzip the files into a directory of your choice. Now that you've downloaded and copied the SDK to your device, let's take a quick look at the contents. The Documents folder has a useful developer guide document with some introductory information about Vulkan, the Android Studio environment, and guides for optimizing applications. There's also a sample guide which overviews the multiple samples in the SDK, and a Getting Started First Triangle guide which details the sample code in depth. One more document describes the process of compiling shaders into Vulkan's SPIR-V format, a slightly trickier process. The header files include the header files for GLM, an OpenGL math library that's equally useful in Vulkan apps, a tiny OBJ loader header file, which we will use to help load OBJ model files, and two Vulkan header files, Vulkan-H and vkplatform.h. The library file contains 32-bit live Vulkan library, which is used to help with the linking of the samples. Runtime libraries will be on the device itself. Finally, the Samples folder contains the complete set of source code, C++ source code and header files, and assets like shader files, textures, and model files. These folders also contain full Android project files and Gradle build files. Now, in the future, it might be possible for you to build these samples for a newer Vulkan version than what's in the SDK, which is 1.0. You'll need to update the Vulkan H and VK Platform H files in the include directory, and also put a compatible vulkan.so in the library folder. Let's try to build and launch one of the SDK examples. The first step is to launch Android Studio. There should be an item in the Start menu to do this once it's been installed. Launch the File menu and locate the SDK, and then the Samples folder, and finally the triangle sample. Select the root file for that sample. You may see some message about Gradle building, which is fine. Click the project table to see an outline of the project. Also, open the event log in Gradle console. Hopefully in the Gradle console you'll see a message about the build being successful. Clean and rebuild the project. Again, check for a build successful message. If you're not getting a successful message, you'll need to check the console for some clues. Again, make sure your Android SDK is up to date and that you've selected the correct folder for the sample. One dependency you'll need to address is the NDK. NDK stands for Native Development Kit and is a tool set that allows you to develop parts of your app using a native code language such as C and C++. Using the NDK is very common with gaming, graphics, and other CPU-intensive apps because of its better performance reasons. All of our Vulkan SDK samples require the NDK. After loading one of the SDK projects, you may see a message at the bottom of the Android Studio dialog saying that the NDK location is not found. If you think you've already had the NDK installed, make sure either the Android NDK home environmental variable is set, or look for a full file called local.properties and add an ndk.dir line. If you don't have the NDK installed, you can use Android Studio to conveniently install it by going to the Tools Android SDK Manager. Or you can install it outside of Android Studio by searching for the download page on Google's Android developer site. Once you do have the NDK installed, make sure either the Android NDK home environmental variable is set, or look for a file called local.properties in the root of the project and add the ndk.dir line to it. It's great that you're now able to build a sample APK, but even be better for you to run it on actual hardware. In order to run the Vulkan SDK samples and see results, you'll need to get your hands on an actual device that has Vulkan supported drivers. Two devices worth mentioning are the Samsung Galaxy S7 and S7 Edge. These are the first commercial devices with Vulkan support. There will be many others coming in the coming months which will be updated for Vulkan support. Another option is to obtain an MDP 820 tablet from Intrinsic. These tablets have Snapdragon 820 with an Adreno 530 GPU capable of running Vulkan applications. We're in the process of updating the builds for these devices to include Vulkan support. Make sure your hardware is connected properly, generally with a USB cable, and make sure that Android's ADB can see your device. You can enter ADB device from a command prompt and verify that the name of the device is returned. Next, in Android Studio, use the menu option Run App, or use the button with the green arrow to have Android Studio deploy and launch your app. You'll next get a dialog asking you to choose which device to run on. You'll need to select an actual device because there isn't a working emulator yet. Select OK, and then you should be able to see the colored triangle rendered on your device. When you close this app, you'll see that there's an icon for the Vulkan triangle sample. Hopefully we've pointed you to some useful Vulkan sources on the web. You've set your machine for Vulkan development by installing the Android Studio and Android SDK. You've downloaded and copied the Adreno SDK for Vulkan. You've successfully built the first triangle sample. Future videos will walk through this sample in detail and show you how to debug the sample on a mobile device and also delve into the Vulkan code to see all the steps involved. Thank you for watching. We hope you enjoyed this video. Please visit the Qualcomm Developer Network to learn more about graphics and tools on Qualcomm's mobile hardware.